In this episode, we're going to explore how Gabby's girlfriend Rose Davis had an indirect role in the Spread Creek incident. Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Do you remember in the early days of the Petito case, we thought Gabby's final proof of life occurred when the "No Service in Yosemite" text was sent to her mother, Nicole Schmidt. Do you remember when that text was sent? Well, it was August 30th. The Daily Mail on the 21st of September 2021 wrote, quote, "Gabby's mother Nicole is convinced her daughter didn't send that final message and that she believes Petito's boyfriend may have sent the message from her phone, possibly to mislead her family and investigators as to her whereabouts," end quote. But there were other cryptic texts too, such as the one highlighted in the warrant. Remember, "Can you help Stan? I just keep getting his voicemails and missed calls." That was also sent to Gabby's mother. Do you remember when that text was sent? According to the affidavit, it was sent on August 27th, likely after the Spread Creek incident, and likely not by Gabby. The time for this text is very significant because it probably narrows down the time of death. Was it sent in the early afternoon or late afternoon, the early evening or the late evening? But to return to the "No Service in Yosemite" text, the critical insight from that text is that it's a misdirection both of time and of place. Now, why would Brian be so worried about time? Well, I think it has a lot to do with Rose Davis and the date of her birthday and the circumstances surrounding that, and Brian becoming quite upset and anxious and perhaps even angry about it. Brian, I believe, was concerned that when more information came to light, it might become obvious what the mechanics actually were in terms of Gabby's disappearance. I mean, in terms of the relationship dynamics and why they were unraveling, and why specifically at the end of August. What was different in terms of the timing of the end of August to any other month? 1 year later, I'm not sure the true crime community can answer this question in a definitive sense. Even Kathleen Hale, the writer of the super insightful Vanity Fair article on Gabby Petito that reviews the timeline in a narrative, in a very compelling narrative chronology, even she fails to locate Rose Davis in terms of knitting her into the fabric of the timeline at the most critical time. And so that is what I want to do here. I want to show you how Gabby's girlfriend may have led to escalating tensions with Brian. That was obviously no fault of Rose herself, but I think it has been underestimated what impact Rose did have on the dynamics and specifically on Brian. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. If you're not getting notifications, you can unsubscribe, resubscribe, hit the notification bell, and also, as always, if you're enjoying the content, you're welcome to show your appreciation by hitting the thanks icon. And let's get started. So, how did Gabby's girlfriend lead to escalating tensions with Brian? Well, do you remember what Rose said? Rose Davis said, "Everything she did, I feel like he thought was wrong." And obviously that's a reference to everything Gabby did, I feel Brian thought was wrong. So what specifically was Gabby doing that Brian thought was so wrong, leading up to sort of August, mid-August, and the end of August? According to the New York Post, quote, Rose said that she'd last spoken to Gabby in early August when they discussed meeting up in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming for Davis's birthday on August 29th. Davis said she had requested off work for the days, but never went after never hearing back from Petito, end quote. That paragraph packs a punch, doesn't it? What's easy to miss or to underestimate the portent of is that although Rose last spoke to Gabby in early August, which let's presume was somewhere in the first week of Gabby's last month, the impression Gabby's best friend had was that Gabby would come back to her and confirm, and that was supposed to happen prior to Rose's birthday on August 29th. And so the obvious question arises, why didn't Gabby confirm? Why didn't Gabby get back to Rose on their plans? Now think about what she says there. Rose said she last spoke to Gabby in early August when they discussed meeting up, right? And then Gabby doesn't get back to her. So the last conversation was about them meeting up. And then the whole question that arises is, through the month of August, how did Brian feel about this meeting up idea at the end of August? And how do you think Gabby felt about the idea? Well, I think Gabby wanted to meet up, but was also waiting for the right time to speak to Brian about it. It could be that she asked Brian in early August and Brian said no. We know that Brian was jealous, controlling, possessive, and thought that their trip was really a honeymoon, and who would want someone to join you on their honeymoon? I think that's fair enough. On the other hand, they were youngsters on a trip together, and why couldn't Gabby see her friend on her birthday for a couple of days? So just think about it. For the whole month of August, this thing is brewing. It's hanging like the sword of Damocles over the whole van life journey. Is Rose coming with or not? And the clock is ticking down to when a decision needs to be made. Gabby wants her to come. Brian doesn't. In fact, Brian feels like he's not number one in Gabby's life. He's not the priority, that he's just sort of a sidekick. And are Gabby's friends more important than what he is? Now, if we go to the actual timeline to try and anchor what we're speculating about in the data, think about what is going on. Did Gabby ask Brian again in mid-August, around the time of the Moab incident? Remember how that argument was described by witnesses, that Brian seemed to be trying to take away Gabby's phone. They were arguing about her phone. Well, what if she wanted to confirm to Rose that she could join them, that Rose could join them even without Brian's permission? Did you know there are more than 100 references to the word phone in the Moab investigative report on the Petito Laundry incident? Well, one of those references is this one. In your report, you state that Redacted observed Brian and Gabby arguing over a phone. Did you investigate this further by speaking with Brian or Gabby about it? Answer, no. Now, I don't want to unnecessarily complicate the fabric that links Rose to the timeline at Spread Creek. Gabby died on August 27th. At that point, Rose was still awaiting confirmation from Gabby about the logistics of their trip together. The idea was that Rose would take a few days off work, and by early August, Rose had apparently already arranged a few days off. The next aspect was to confirm where they would meet up and for exactly how long. But for some reason, there was a problem from Gabby's side. Gabby wasn't providing clarity or confirmation. In fact, Gabby hadn't even contacted Rose following the Moab incident. Why do you think she didn't? Is it because the Moab incident was caused in part by Rose, where near to the middle of the month, Gabby had to raise the issue of Rose's birthday again with Brian, and Brian then being triggered as a result? Rose actually said something along these lines. She said, for her anxiety to act up like that, meaning for Gabby's anxiety to act up during the Moab incident, there has to be a decent thing to trigger it. Those are Rose Davis's words. Let me read that again. For her anxiety to act up like that, there has to be a decent thing to trigger it. And she was very aware that Gabby suffered from anxiety. But then after the Moab incident, the days continued ticking closer and closer to Rose's birthday, which was on August the 29th. And it wasn't just any birthday. It was a big deal birthday, a 21st birthday. So Rose had a lot riding on her reunion with Gabby. It wasn't just going to be tagging along or just camping. It would be a celebration between two friends, and Brian would be the one tagging along or not. And probably as the month wore on, Rose started texting Gabby, perhaps also commenting on her social media, words to the effect of call me or what's happening or please get in touch. Rose herself could probably confirm this. And so if Rose was doing that, we don't know this for sure, but if she was saying, call me, what's happening, whatever you guys decided, please get in touch, why didn't Gabby respond? And I think if you just turn on your imagination and you imagine the real-time scenario where Gabby is actually getting these messages, wouldn't the obvious thing be to say she's holding her phone, they're in the vehicle together, they're in the van together, they're perhaps in a tent together, and Gabby says, "Oh, I've just heard from Rose. Rose wants to join us. What do you think?" And then that leading to unhappiness from Brian's side, and Brian perhaps wanting to see exactly what Rose said, and or perhaps also saying, "I haven't made up my mind yet," or "Don't get back to her. She's going to spoil everything," or something like that. So on this question, why Gabby didn't get back to Rose, Rose actually said, "I'm a little upset that she didn't just call me after that fight, because she would have before." And that is a reference to the Moab incident. Rose is just curious, why didn't Gabby get back to her? Again, she was probably waiting for a gap or for tensions to subside or for the right moment. But I mean, another thing to consider is if Gabby spent the night in the van while Brian was in the hotel, that was a whole night that she was by herself. She could have used that time to get back to Rose. Another possibility is, did Brian have access to something like a shared iCloud account? Was Brian able to see what Gabby was doing online? It's just a question. And is that the reason why Gabby didn't want to reveal who she was calling or what she was doing online? Rose also told the Daily Mail on September 17th, just 2 days before human remains were found at Spread Creek Camp, she told the Daily Mail the following, quote, "When I saw that Brian was back from the trip, that was the first thing that popped into my mind, that Brian had one of his episodes, and I was just hoping he didn't have a snapping moment," Rose said. The article goes on to note, quote, "Rose had even asked her boss for days off for the trip. They were planning to lock in a specific date on August 29, Rose's birthday, but Gabby never called. The next day, Gabby's mother, Nicole Schmidt, received a text from her daughter's phone with a confusing message, 'No service in Yosemite.' Are you seeing how Rose Davis is indirectly part of the fabric of the circumstances in the month of August, and especially to the end? Do you see how it is related to that? Now, I'm not sure what lock in a specific date means. Does it mean they were going to arrange a date, a place to celebrate her birthday and have a party? Or did it mean they were going to lock in travel dates for when Rose was going to join Gabby and Brian? If you think about it, remember Brian went home for a week between August 17th and August 23rd. He went back to Florida. Theoretically, if Brian went home, say, a week later, Rose could have joined while Brian was away. Rose could have joined Gabby sort of over her birthday period when Brian wouldn't have been there anyway. On the other hand, it's possible Brian left Gabby because they were arguing and because of the situation with Rose. It's also strange that, as far as we know, even during this week when they were apart, Gabby still didn't get back to Rose. When she was alone in this hotel in Salt Lake City, she still didn't elect to get in touch with Rose. And this was likely because she was working on that YouTube video, editing it, and also working on getting their blog up and running. But there was likely another possibility too. Gabby possibly feared that Brian wouldn't return if Rose became an issue again. And equally, if Gabby said, "By the way, Rose is joining us after all," while Brian is somewhere else, well, then Brian might say, "Well, then I'm not coming back." So Gabby probably would have had Brian as her priority, wanting him to come back. And once he did, well, then the secondary priority was, could Rose join them? Does that make sense? I mean, within the dynamics of their relationship as it was. So I think Gabby feared that Brian wouldn't return if Rose became an issue again. And Gabby, for whatever reason, felt like she absolutely needed Brian to be a wingman, to be her driver, her photographer, her companion, in order to complete the journey. In Gabby's mind, there was no van life adventure part 2 without Brian. The problem was Brian equally confident? Was Brian worried that Gabby was having a change of heart about him? When Brian did return on August 23rd, it took them just 2 days to arrive at the Grand Tetons, and it was possibly in this stupendous mountainous setting that things settled and improved and seemed to get a little better. On August 25th, a sort of round number date and just 4 days before Rose's birthday, Gabby possibly felt she had a duty to Rose and had no choice but to push one last time, to petition Brian that Rose join them. Brian, is it okay if Rose joins us? Rose said that Gabby and Brian never fought in front of her, but she believed she could tell when they had just had an argument. She said that in the first year of knowing her, Gabby spent between 7 and 10 nights at her house after they had fought. This suggests that nighttime was particularly bad for Brian and Gabby. We know at the Merry Piglets at noon on the 27th that members of the public witnessed the raw discord between Brian and Gabby and the staff. The fact that it was a public spat, and the second public spat in 2 weeks, shows just how badly tensions had unraveled towards the end of August. So this is also what Rose Davis said to the Daily Mail. She said, "I do believe that their relationship, as they kept going on, was getting more problematic. It just seemed like there was more and more arguments," she told the Daily Mail, adding that they still planned on getting married despite Petito telling her mother it was called off. So that's something to emphasize. Gabby told her mother that the marriage was called off. I don't know whether Brian did the same to his parents. Anyway, on September 16, 3 days before Gabby's remains were found, the Daily Beast also reported on Rose Davis, who was expecting a call from Gabby that never came at the time of her death. And this is such an important quote from the Daily Beast. Quote, "Van lifer Gabrielle Petito was supposed to meet a friend in Yellowstone on August 30, but the 22-year-old missed the rendezvous and never called," the friend tells The Sun. On the friend's birthday, August 29, Petito failed to phone and make concrete plans. End quote. So this is the dynamic, this is the question that was afoot and becoming more and more urgent as the month of August wore on. Can you see that? Another possibility is that Gabby wouldn't have not called Rose on her birthday, especially her 21st birthday. So whatever the reasons for Gabby not calling Rose, Gabby would have definitely called her on her birthday on August 29th, and one can imagine Brian dreading this inevitable call. Going back to the Daily Beast, quote, "The friend said, she was supposed to call on my birthday and we were going to figure it all out then because her trip wasn't on schedule. The whole thing is odd. My birthday's the 29th. I don't know why she'd sent that text to her mom and not message me." That's a reference to the no service in Yosemite text. On August 30th, the day after Rose's birthday, Petito's mother received a text from Petito's number about not having cell service in Yosemite, 800 miles away. And so Rose also said the following, "Gabby wouldn't wander off and not contact her family. I know that for a fact. She wouldn't blow me off either. She's my person. And I can't stop thinking about how scared she must be," the friend said, end quote. The thing that I think is also missing in all of the discussion and to some extent amnesia following the Petito case is that Rose Davis was basically Gabby's best friend in 2021. So it was her best friend, and then Brian was obviously the person closest to her. And so obviously Gabby's friend, Rose, who didn't approve that much of Brian, she'd actually said in certain times, you must be careful. Are you sure this is what you want? She sort of delicately said to Gabby, be careful of Brian. Maybe he's not the best person for you. And Brian would have felt and known that Rose didn't like him and perhaps disapproved of him. And if you weigh up what's going on, you weigh up that her best friend doesn't really approve of him. Gabby's parents are aware of him as well. Gabby's even expressed to them that they've put the marriage off, that they're no longer going to get married. You can see how Brian is seeing this perfect fairy tale, this perfect marriage with this perfect girl evaporating in front of him, and then he's wondering who's to blame. Well, first it's Rose that's to blame, then it's her family. But then when he's got Gabby on her own and she starts turning on him in his eyes, in his mind, possibly in a paranoia type state, then who is left to blame? Well, just Gabby. Is Brian going to blame Brian? Well, not likely. If all of this sounds a little bit childish, a little bit immature, bear in mind these were young 22, 23-year-olds. They were young, and love is often immature anyway, whether you are 20-something, 30-something, 40-something. Love is often a little bit unreasonable and irrational, but particularly when you're very young, and even more so if you're insecure, inadequate, and there are people around you that disapprove of your relationship. Don't you remember when you were 20-something and certain people criticized you in terms of someone that you really liked, how you felt about it? That is a totally different setup when you are still setting up your identity, you don't have a job, you don't have a home. That kind of criticism can feel like your entire house of cards, who you are as a person, your status, your world, can crumble, can come crashing down. So I hope you found this particular analysis insightful. I haven't really seen much of the same thing, just seeing the importance of Rose Davis in the psychology, in the dynamics of the relationship, emphasized the way that I think it needs to be. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
I don't really know what comes next. I'm just doing my best, even though I'm so stressed out. Everything just feels like a test that I fail, so depressed when I can't seem to get out. But something deep inside won't let me quit. I swear that I'm inspired by all this shit. Tell me that I can and I won't. That's what guides me the most. Fuck your lies, I'll do what I want. The gas in the back of the set, never leave, she's so bad. Hit the bag, the gas in the back of the set, never leave, she's so bad. Hit the bag, the gas in the back of the set, never leave, she's so bad. Hit the bag, the gas in the back of the set, never leave, she's so bad. Hit the bag, I'm inspired by thirst, I'm inspired by worth. I desire your worst, so you can just hide while I work. I ain't tired, you first. I'll write a second, third verse about the lies you go disperse. You never did shit, I know it hurts. Something deep inside won't let me